The Statement of Jared Johnson by Geraldine Bonner. I'm going to write my side of the famous Johnson case. It's a pretty hard thing to go over in cold blood, but I want the public to hear my version of the story. They know the case against me has been dismissed, and they've read in all the papers what I said, but it's been so mixed up and so misrepresented that I've decided to make my own statement and write down as simply and as honestly as I can just how it came that I was to be a suspect. My name is Jared Johnson, and until I was arrested on the 23rd of last December, I was the janitor at the Fremont building and had been for the past 2 years. The Fremont, as people now know, since the trial made it famous, is an old building off Washington Square. It was one of those houses that still exist in that quarter of the city, which used to be homes of the gentry and gradually got down in the world till they were the first sliced off into flats and then split up into offices. The Fremont had been a fine, well-built house in the beginning, and even when I came into it, it was in good repair. But it was old-fashioned, without elevators or electric lights, and the offices rented for low prices. The top story had been used as a photograph gallery and had long glass skylights in the ceiling. But that was before my time. Ever since I'd been janitor, it had been leased by a society of ladies for a studio. One batch painted there all morning and another all afternoon. They had models used to go up and pose for them who were forever clattering up and down the stairs, mostly Italians and generally pretty tough-looking lot. This room was a good deal of a charge for me, for I had to keep it heated up to a tremendous temperature because the models stood up to be painted in their skins as God made them. And if they were Dagos, I couldn't let them take their deaths. So at one end of the room, under a corner skylight, was curtained off for them to use as a dressing room. Below this, there were 4 floors of offices and lodgings, and in the basement, I and my wife, Rosie, had our rooms. I have to be particular about describing all of this because I want all who read my statement to have everything clear in their minds. Just about the middle of December, there was a great frost, the worst cold snap I remember, and I came to New York from Ohio when I was 12. On the morning of December 17th, Rosie told me that the thermometer outside Miss Maitland, the typewriter's window, had dropped to 3 above zero. It was mortal cold, and I kept busy building fires and seeing that steam heat was on full pressure. I was proud of the old Fremont, for not a pipe in her burst or froze. And next door at the Octagon building, a brand new skyscraper, 12 stories with all the modern improvements, the pipes on our side burst and froze so that the ice was clogged down the sides of them in a huge mass with icicles as long as your arm. I noticed this on the morning of December 17th when I was rubbing off the skylights in the studio. I was standing on a stepladder when I looked up the wall of the Octagon rising like a cliff, and just on the angle, a little above the roof where the pipes were, the ice wrapped around them like a winding sheet. I couldn't help laughing, for they'd blown so about the Octagon and their modern improvements. 2 days later, a black frost broke, and it was the biggest thaw that was ever seen. It got soft and warm like spring. The streets began to swim with water, and all day long the boys were coming down from the offices and complaining of the steam heat. I was on the rush all day, for to add everything else, it was Saturday, and Rosie and I had most of the building to ourselves, and that day we do all the cleaning. But we didn't do as much as usual that Saturday, for as I had to tell on the trial, so I must speak it now, Rosie and I had a falling out. We'd been bickering for quite a while past, and Saturday it seemed like we couldn't meet on the stairs or hand each other a broom or a pail without snapping and nagging. I'm not blaming her, for I was as ugly as she, only my temper is not of that kind. It's still the sort of sulky sort, and it rises slowly, but it takes a long time to cool. The trouble between us was this. Heaven forgive me for raking it all up after Rosie proved herself to be the truest wife a man ever had, but it's part of my statement and has to go in. Rosie was jealous. She'd always been inclined that way, and when we first married and everything, she didn't seem just about right. I tried never to bother or annoy her. But after 5 years of marriage, I wasn't quite so considerate. No, I swear before heaven I never did aught that any man mightn't do without shame or blame. I wasn't so mindful of what Rosie liked or disliked. I know that now. Without meaning of it, I must have provoked her often. I suspect I did it to tease her a little, and I expect I did it to prove to her that I was my own master and wasn't going to have any woman dictating to me. It was one of the models up in the ladies' studio that Rosie was jealous about. Most of them being Dagos, as black as mulattoes, and only speaking their own talk. I had no words with them. But there was one of them, Alice Marion, who was of an Irish parentage but American-born, and when I struck up an acquaintance with her, We used to stop and pass on the time of day when we met on the stairs or in the hall. Rosie took a dislike to Alex Marion right from the start. She said she couldn't bear her because she was a model. Nothing that you could say would make Rosie believe that a girl could be honest and earn a living that way. As for Alice Marion's looks, she couldn't understand why anyone wanted to paint her picture. To tell the truth, I often thought this too, for Alice wasn't what you'd call a pretty girl. She had freckles, yellow greenish eyes, and a big bush of red hair that stood out like flames around her head. I liked the girl, and I was sorry for her. She was one of the best I ever knew, honest as a die and straight as a string for all her being a model. She supported her mother, and if I was ever sure of anything in my life, I was sure that Alice Marion's character. But I wasn't any more taken with her than a married man might honestly be taken with any decent girl. On Saturday afternoon, the ladies going home early, I made it my business to clean up the studio and lock it till Monday morning. On Saturday, December 19th, the ladies left even earlier than usual. The day settling down dark and threatening rain, and I got up about 4 and I went up with my broom and pail. I was mightily surprised when I opened the door to see Alice sitting huddled up, cowering over the stove. She was right under the middle skylight, and the gray, wintry light fell on her red hair that was loosely knotted up and looked like a fiery crown. From under her skirt, her bare feet were thrust out on the stove's edge. She had a shawl folded around her shoulders with a bare arm white as marble coming out. "Why, Alice," said I, "what's up? It's past 4 and you're here. You're not even dressed yet." She looked up at me, and I saw her cheeks were pale and her eyes looked dull and heavy. "I feel sick," she said, drawing her hand over her forehead and pushing back her hair. "I got something sure. A while ago I was as hot as a stove, and now I'm freezing." She crouched over it, spreading out her hands, and I touched one of them. It was like ice. As I stood up looking at her, I heard the first drops of rain. Big, heavy, slow drops fall on the skylight. "You caught a bad cold," I said to her. "You want something warm to warm you up. You think a cup of tea would do you good?" Her face brightened directly. "Oh, Mr. Johnson," she said, "do you think you could get me one? I didn't have a bite of lunch today. I felt so bad. And then I stood here for 2 hours, and that's hard work, even when you're well. I think if I could get something hot, I'd feel better." She looked up at me with her big yellowish eyes shining through the gray light. And if ever I was sorry for a woman, it was for her. I wish that Rosie wasn't so down on her, and I'd taken her down to our rooms and given her a good meal. "Rest easy here," I said. "I'll get you a bite, and that will brace you for up. I won't be long." And I went out and down the halls feeling angrier than ever with Rosie for her senseless prejudice. I hoped and prayed that there might be no one in the kitchen, and things went my way for once. Rosie was not there, so I made a little brew of tea, and I cut some bread and butter, and I put it on a tray and set off up the stairs. And it was here my luck deserted me, for on the second landing I met Miss Maitland going out. "What's the matter?" says she, looking at the tray. "Anyone sick?" It didn't cross my mind not to tell the truth, and I answered, "The model, ma'am, on the top floor has caught a chill and feels bad." Miss Maitland laughed and went down the stairs, and her testimony in court, if you remember, was pretty damaging for me. On the 4th floor, I ran into Mr. Raymond on the landing. Mr. Raymond is my favorite in the whole Fremont. He's a stenographer and rents all the back rooms on that floor, some of them for offices and the rest for his own lodgings. "Hello, Johnson," he says to me in his jolly way, taking that up to me. "Made a mistake this time. It's not my particular tipple." I laughed, for we all knew Mr. Raymond's tipple was a pretty strong one. "No, sir," I said. "It's for Alice Marion in the studio. She's taking a chill. She's had nothing to eat since morning. I thought this would warm her up a little." "Ah, poor girl," he says, going down the passage to his own rooms. Then over his shoulder he called, "If you want anything stronger, if she feels faint or anything, just drop in on me and I'll give it to you." And he went down the passage. Those 2 meetings were about as bad for me as they could be, it turned out afterward. I went into the studio and I found Alice just as I had left her. She drank the tea and ate the bread with a relish, and I began to get things ready for my cleaning. Now and then we spoke to each other, and between whiles we could hear the rain drumming on the skylight. It grew dark and leadened, and as I moved I could see through the skylights the big wall of the octagon, with its windows springing out in yellow squares as the gases were lit. When Alice finished, I knew she'd want to dress and go home, so I made an excuse to go. She watched me as I set the tea things back on the tray, and then said suddenly, "You're very good to me. Let's shake hands." I was surprised, but I took her hand and shook it. "You're a good girl," I said to her. "Mind you remember that I'm always your friend." "Thanks, Jared Johnson," she said quite solemnly. "I know that. Goodbye." I turned around and went, some way or other feeling sort of strange and odd. I shut the door behind me and I was on the stairs when I heard her lock it. In the kitchen, I found Rosie. The moment she saw the tray, her face darkened. She pulled up short in her work and eyed me with a sharp look. I was irritable myself, angry with her for treatment of Alice Marion, and when she looked at me that way, it made me blaze up. Without waiting for her to ask me, I told her who the tray was for and where I'd been. I don't think it necessarily for me to tell just what we said to one another, but we had a quarrel, and it was a bitter one. Now that both of us felt what real misery is, we realized with shame what a pair of crazy fools we were. But we thought nothing then but our own anger. I don't remember all I said. I felt that black rage a man sometimes feels when a woman he loves and honors flings in his teeth low meanness he never thought of doing. In the middle of it, I got up and ran out of the room, banging the door, went down to the cellar and stayed there all night sleeping on a pile of gunny sacks in front of the furnace. The next day, Rosie and I were about as stiff to each other as we could be. We hardly spoke at all and ate our meals in heavy silence. Monday morning broke with a blue sky and sunlight outside, but between us there was still cloudy weather. I got up early, for I had to build the fires in some of the offices, especially in the studio, which by 8 o'clock was supposed to be warmed and ready for class. I went up to the 3rd flight of stairs, and Mr. Raymond came along on the landing. "Hello, Johnson," he says to me. "What the devil's the matter with this building? Is she settling?" "Fremont's as good as she ever was, sir," I answered. "What's the matter?" "The ceiling's coming down in my bathroom," says he. "Early this morning, wham, bang, down she came. Come and see the scene of carnage." Followed him into the bathroom, which opened off the end of the passage, and there, sure enough, the ceiling was down. Picked up a piece of plaster and felt that it was wet. "A leak," I said. "The rain's come in above." "Oh, then," he says suddenly, "that explains the crash of glass I heard Saturday evening. It was a tremendous smashing glass from somewhere up there." It startled me. I suppose I looked sort of alarmed, for Mr. Raymond said, "I'll go up with you. Probably the skylight's broken." We ran up the last flight and tried the studio door, and it was locked. When I tried my key, I found that there was already one in the keyhole. I don't know then just what I thought, but I know a deadly feeling of fear took hold of my heart. Mr. Raymond must have seen it in my face. "Break in the door," says he in a low voice, and as he spoke, he put his shoulder to the panel and pressed. In a moment, we had ripped off the old socket that held the lock, and the door burst in. There was a sudden sharp current of air, cold and wet, and the brown curtain over the model's dressing corner swelled out in a draft. A window was open somewhere, and that part of the floor was dark with rain stains. We shut the door with the key still in the lock and ran to where the curtain fell back against its straight folds. Behind it, we saw a sight that neither of us will ever forget. Alice Marion lay on her face on the floor, skylight above her broken, and the fragments of glass scattered in every direction. She was fully dressed except for her shoes, one of which she held in her hand. Through the broken skylight, the rain had beaten upon her till her clothes, the floor, her hair were oozing with moisture. The latter was wet with something else, which dyed it a deeper red. The back of her skull was fractured and partially driven in. She was rigid in death, her eyes open, and an expression of strange, terrified surprise stamped upon her features. That first glimpse impressed every detail of the room upon my mind. Her hat and jacket were hanging from a peg on the wall. On the shelf under the square of looking-glass lay some hairpins and a purse. All about on her dress and her hair and on the floor shone bits of the shivered skylight. The panes of glass were of a good size and were fitted into light, thin supports of iron. Just in the middle, 2 of these were bowed downward. We bent over to see her if there were any signs of life, but she was cold and stiff as a marble statue. The physicians afterwards said that when we found her, she'd been dead about 36 hours. She'd evidently been putting on her shoes when struck down by a terrific blow that killed her. That is as truthful a description as I can write of the finding of Alice Marion's body. I ought to know how to do it by this time. I've told it so often, but I've dreamed it night after night till I wonder if I'm going on dreaming it forever. The next day I was arrested on suspicion as the murderer, and a week later I was indicted by the grand jury. My trial followed in 2 months. I never knew until I was in danger of losing my life on circumstantial evidence how important the most insignificant things can become when people are looking for incriminating actions and words. Foolish things I had said came up against me black as night. The cup of tea I took to the girl was as bad for me as if it had been a cup of poison. But worst of all was the quarrel I had with Rosie. It all had to come out. And the newspapers went out on my side and said it was as bad for me as if I'd been caught red-handed. I could see as plain as anybody that the case against me was a strong one. It started on the theory that I was in love with Alice Marion. Both Rosie and I acknowledged that we'd more than once quarreled about her. On the afternoon of December 19th, I had a final interview with her, and there were different opinions as to what this had been about. Some had said she'd threatened to expose me to my wife, who was jealous already. Others that she'd given me to understand she wouldn't have anything to do with me. Whatever she said, she'd scared or angered me till I crept up from her on the back and struck it dead with one, or some thought 2 savage blows. To turn aside suspicion, I then locked the door and the key left in it, and had broken the skylight, the noise of which Mr. Raymond had heard a few minutes after 5, and under the cover of the dark, I dropped from the roof to the fire escapes. And when I got to the kitchen, my nerves were naturally unstrung, and I'd quarreled with my wife. I left the room, and hadn't been seen again until the morning. The one link in the chain which did not fit was how I had brought the tea tray down with me. The only way I could have done this was to have put it outside the door, and then, after escaping by the fire ladders, crept up for it and come down again. This, people said, was proof of my fiendish coolness and cunning. The fact that the evidence pointed to no one else made it all the worse for me. There did not seem to be a human creature but myself who could be suspected. The girl had no enemies and no follower that anybody knew of. She had led a quiet and perfectly respectable life. That the object was not theft was proved by the fact that her purse containing $20 was untouched. There was no doubt that somebody had murdered her, and a murder could be fastened on no one but me. On the upper part of the occiput, just below the crown, the skin and flesh had been cleanly cut as though struck with some sharp-edged or pointed. There were expert surgeons called up to examine the wounds, and they each had their own ideas as to what the murderer had used. One thought it was a bayonet, or something shaped like a bayonet, such as a pickaxe or an ice pick. Another said a hatchet or an axe. And one, he was the most celebrated of the lot, said he thought that not one but 2 implements had been employed, a sharp one which cut the scalp and a heavy one which fractured the skull. It was this man who said that the murderer had evidently been in a state of frenzy, as the blow or the blows must have been a terrific force that so crushed the skull. His evidence started the theory that the girl had been killed by a maniac who entered and come out by the skylight. The first days of the trial were so terrible I hate to think of them. The whole world seemed against me. The reporters used to come and talk with me and then write me up as, quote, a man with the face of an assassin, unquote, or describe me as, quote, the human bloodhound, unquote. Some of them were friendly fellows, too, used to clap me on the back and say, brace up, old boy. They've not got enough evidence to convict you. But when it came to believing me, that was quite another story. Always Jared Johnson, a suspect, as they called me, a good case to make copy out of, and that was all. There was one of them I didn't take much notice of, a stocking at first. He was the youngest-looking chap for his age I ever saw. When I first saw him, I thought he was about 18. He was a little thin, smooth-faced, light-haired boy, new to the business, and you could see by the quiet, bashful sort of way he hung around when the others were there. One day he got me alone and began to talk to me, easy and natural, as man to man. He told me he was from Ohio, as I was, and that broke the ice right off. He said his name was John Paul Hayne, and that he was 26 years old, and he sat a while talking of places in the old state we both knew, and I got to feel as if I was a civilized Christian once more, not an Apache Indian all the world was chasing. When he got up to go, he stood round for a minute in an uneasy sort of way, and then he suddenly says to me, looking me straight in the eye, Jared Johnson, you're not guilty of that murder. He didn't say it as if he was asking a question or if he was trying to persuade himself. He just stated a fact. I looked back at him and I said as quietly as he, you're right, but what makes you think so? Oh, he says, speaking in a queer sort of way he had with him, I can see a church by daylight, and I've seen a lot while I've been loafing around here. Next time he came with a long talk, he told me he'd viewed the premises and the body the morning of the murder was discovered. He was sent by his paper, The Scoop, and since then had been several times on his own account. You know, he says, I come to the conclusion that the thing that killed Alice Marion didn't go through the skylight, it came through it. What makes you think that, I asked. The way the iron stanchions were bent. They say the weight of a man hanging to them was pulling himself up, bowed him down. Now I say that's a mistake. To bend those rods the way a man would have to be a giant, a second Sandow. It was the weight of something that struck them from above, a tremendous weight that bent and almost broke them. But what could strike down from there, I asked. There's nothing between a roof and the Fremont and heaven. That's the trick, he says. You could tell me what you could, and I'll tell you what killed Alice Marion. It seemed to me all idle talk, but I couldn't stop saying, I don't see how you can make that out. Alice was struck in the back of the head. If the thing fell on it, it would have caught her on the top of the head. She must have been standing right under the skylight. He leaned forward and put his finger on my arms, his eyes shining like jewels. Johnson, he says, you're an honest man. I've no doubt about it, but you've not got much sense. Don't you remember she was putting on his shoes? Did you ever see a woman put on his shoes? She leans over so that her head is bent forward this way. He bent his head down far until the back of his neck was stretched out beyond the collar. I guess you and the doctor have got the same idea, said I. There's nothing that could come down from above that could strike her dead with one blow but a madman who'd been creeping about the roofs. I worked over that theory for some time, he says, but I've come to the conclusion there's nothing in it. Between the breaking of the glass and the falling of the blow, she could have got to the door. No, she was surprised as she was putting on his shoes, surprised and killed in the same instant. I thought of the expression on her face that morning when we found her dead and stiff, and I looked at John Paul Hay, nodded without speaking. After this, I saw him every few days. He asked me lots of questions, and I got to answering them pretty freely, for I saw that he didn't publish what I said, and I got a great liking for him. He was forever starting theories, but it didn't seem that they came to anything. It was just about this time that a second cold snap struck the city. It was precious cold in my cell, and I thought of the old Fremont, Rosie sitting with the fire shining through the bars of the grate. Lord, but those times seem a long way off. Rosie came to see me with her ears tied up in a worsted scarf. She said it was not as cold as the first step, but nonetheless the octagon pipes had frozen and burst again. Some of the octagon people had come over to the Fremont asking for rooms. They said the octagon was a sham run up by a contract and badly built from the curbstone to the chimneys. Because of all these applications, the owner of the Fremont were thinking of tearing out the inside of the studio and fitting it up for offices. But so far it stood there just like it did the morning Alice Marion's body was found there. The detective workings on the case wouldn't have it touched. The cold spell was a short one. The back of the window was broken, and it gave way to 3 days with a big thaw. Sun beat down like spring, and everything ran water. My trial was going on daily. The evidence for the defense was nearly all in. I was in a strange state of mind. Sometimes I felt wild, as if I was being smothered, and then again I'd be dull and dead-like and not caring what happened. People kept on saying they can't convict you on the evidence they've got, but I didn't care much for that. Even if the jury disagreed, I was ruined. I'd have to go back to the world for the rest of my life, be pointed out as the man who had brutally murdered a poor, sick, defenseless girl. I'd rather die, only for Rosie. In the afternoon of the third warm day, I'll never forget that day if I live to be 200. The window of the cell was open, and every now and then a little breath of soft air came in, air full of spring. I was alone, sick at heart and deadbeat. I've been in courtrooms since that morning. It had Rosie on the stand, and the poor girl mixed up, made things between us look as bad as could be. Then seeing what she had done and being weak and frightened, she'd gone off into hysterics. They could not get her into any sort of condition to go on. So the case had been called off till Monday, and I'd seen Rosie taken out sobbing and half dead and been brought back to my cell. I was sitting on the edge of the bed when I heard the rattling of bolts and the voices at the door, and in came Hayne. The light from the window fell full on his face, and it shone as if there were a lamp lit inside it. The look of him brought me to my feet as I'd been yanked up by a derrick. I said something. I don't know what. Maybe I didn't speak at all, but I know I tried to. Without saying a word, he took off his hat and held it up to me. I looked at it stupidly. It was a brown derby, the top broken and split. Look at that, Johnson, he says, shaking it under my eyes. Look at it. Well, it saved you. Do you understand me? It saved your life. I stared at him and tried to say something, but my tongue wouldn't work. He pushed me back on the bed and, holding the hat in front of me, began to talk quick with his breath catching in between like a man who's been running. My hat's been ruining that studio of yours, the studio of the Fremont. Fortunately, Raymond and his assistant stenographer were there and saw the catastrophe. See? He said, thrusting his hand through the hole in the crown. What a blow. A blow, I said. Who struck it? The same person who struck Alex Marion. We were silent for a second, staring at each other. I could hear my heart beating like a hammer. Then he began, I've been in that studio a good deal lately, studying the place. Today I stopped there about midday to have another look at those bent rods we've so often spoken of. On the landing I met Raymond and his assistant. They went in with me, as I wanted to explain to them my idea about the rods. I got a chair under the broken skylight and they stood below listening to my explanation. As I stood that way, the sun beat down on my head almost as hot as summer, and I could hear the dripping of water from the icicles on the octagon pipes. All of a sudden, without warning, I heard a sharp snapping sound. There was a crushing noise, and something struck me on the head, a stultifying blow. I shouted and struck up, and Raymond and the stenographer caught me as I fell, for I was stunned for a moment. When I pulled myself together, I saw the floor was covered with icicles and chunks of solid ice. Looking up, we could see that a great bunch, which had been hanging from the pipes, had broken off, snapped by its own weight in a thaw. I fell back on the bed, holding his hand and stammering something, heaven knows what. "Brace up, old man," he says. "You can see daylight now, all right." Raymond says that the icicles on the pipe and the frost would triple that in size and weight. They bent the iron rods and tore the skylight out. They murdered Alice Marion. All you can say is that they killed her quickly. Must have fallen in two detachments, vibration of the first break dislodging the second mass, which came almost in the same instant. Glass was broken, and a huge, jagged iceberg with its pointed daggers must have plunged through the opening and in one breath struck the girl senseless and lifeless. "Why, pull yourself together, old man. You're as white as chalk." Well, that's it. The rest of the story is too well known through the papers for me to tell it. The case of the state against Jared Johnson was dismissed. It was a great day when I said goodbye to them all and came out into the daylight again, an innocent man. But I'm not going to stay here. No, too many people know me by sight and stare at me. I can't bear to pass the old Fremont. Rosie and I are going back to Ohio. My brother has a farm there, and I'm to help him work on it with him. As for John Paul Hayne, I'm glad to say they've raised his salary on the scoop. One of those sensational papers offered him $100 a week, but he wouldn't take it. He is a fine boy. He's promised to write me every 2 weeks.